on at least two different occasions. So by this point in time, you're looking at, as he is writing, now it's not taking place, but as he's writing, he's covering the time frame, helping them to understand that there's two times that they've come in. One is 605 BC, and you can find side information to this in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through verse 6, and then also 597 BC, and the context here would be 2 Kings 24, verses 10 through verse 16. Thousands have been taken into Babylon. The class of people that were deported, they were the better class, the upper class. You're more educated, you're more skilled people. The lower class would have been left behind, and they would have overtaken the houses as well as the positions that the people that have been taken into exile have left behind. Jerusalem had been a place of worship and also the place for festal activities since the days of David. Solomon had finished building the temple, and God vowed that he would meet his people there so long as they kept his commandments. Had they been keeping his commandments? Absolutely not. And therefore, that's why we're reading about the consequences that came upon Israel, the northern kingdom, and then now that's about to come upon the southern kingdom. Henceforth, the consequences were very serious. Judah's rebellion and disobedience had become a reality as many Jews now found themselves in Babylonian captivity. All along, they were hearing that it was a time of peace and safety, right? And who was telling them that? It wasn't Jeremiah, it was the false prophets. All along then too, especially as we've come forward, they've been told, well, okay, you're going to go into captivity, but it's not going to last very long. Hananiah, we talked about him last week. And there were many others who were just like this man. When you look at what we find here, you're reading Jeremiah's letter. And what do we find? It was to the Jews that were scattered from Jerusalem to Babylon. The letter, it became a declaration of independence from the temple as a meeting place with God. For nearly 400 years, that's a long time, we find that there was this deep-seated idea that the temple of the Lord was the throne of His glory. And that idea goes all the way back to chapter 7 and verse 4. When you think about the temple, was the temple really the dwelling place of God? No. God doesn't dwell in structures in a literal sense, but yet it represented God's dwelling with His people. However, their idea of all this is that literally God was dwelling there. This was His house of abode. Jeremiah's letter was to send the thought that not only could God be found in Jerusalem, but God can be found in Babylon. Did God totally forsake His people in Babylon? No, He was there for them. And we find that He was working for them to help bring them to a better understanding of who He was and what He expected out of them and future generations. The letter shows that a relationship with God could be independent of localities and national boundaries. I think about John chapter 4, verses 19 through 24, with the Samaritan woman. And the Samaritan woman spoke about the coming of the Messiah and how the Jews worship in Jerusalem, and yet they worshiped in yet another mountain, on another mountain. And what did Jesus say? He said, the hour is coming. It wasn't going to be about a location. It wasn't going to be about Jerusalem. But He says the hour is coming when they will worship God in spirit and in truth. And so God wanted His people all the way back even then to understand is that the temple served as a meeting place where God would be with His people. But yet at the same time, God has no boundaries. God is everywhere. And he wanted Judah to understand this. This was a novel and much needed concept for the exiles in that difficult time. This letter that Jeremiah has written, of course, we know he's writing by inspiration. These were not things that he wrote on his own accord. By many scholars, it is considered one of the greatest letters in all of literature. And we're not surprised, because God doesn't inspire second-class literature, correct? Everything that he gives us is plain and simple. Okay, open your Bibles to chapter 29, and we're going to begin with verse 1. Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah, the prophet, sent from Jerusalem to the remainder of the elders who were carried away captive, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. Let's break this down a little bit. The meaning of the phrase elders, a remainder of the elders, there are a number of ways that can be taken. It can simply refer to the elders that were there in Babylon in comparison to those that would have been left in Jerusalem. We don't know how many, if any, for certain of these leaders were left there, but yet at the same time it stands to reason that possibly this is the case. Also, it is thought that these leaders, whenever they were taken into Babylon, is that some of them, not only are they taken into exile, but maybe some of them have been imprisoned and even executed. And therefore, if that's the case, then it should be translated, rather than the remainder, more so as the rest, meaning those who survived. So, unto whom is this letter given? It is given to the priest, to the prophets, and to the people that Nebuchadnezzar has carried away captive. So it's speaking to those who are in exile. Verse 2. This happened after Jehoiachin, the king, the queen mother, the eunuch, the princess of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsman and the smith had departed from Jerusalem. So simply what he is identifying is that this letter has taken place, and the instances that are going to be discussed in this context are after the deportation, after they have been taken into Babylonian captivity. If you look at verse 3, the letter was sent by the hand of Elisha, the son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, saying. So when you look at verse 2, we're able, based out of the mentioning of the people who were taken into captivity, we're able from this parenthetical note to understand more so when this letter was written. This was given during the second deportation. This writing was thereafter. The second deportation in 597 BC. Verse 3. When you look at verse 3, the letter was carried by two influential men in Judah. When you look at the first one that we mentioned here, Elisha, his brother Ahikam was the one who protected Jeremiah when others wanted him killed. And you can take that back to chapter 26, verses 8, and also verse 24. Another brother, Gemariah, was one of the men who pled with King Jehoiakim not to burn Jeremiah's scroll. And we'll study that later on in chapter 36 and verse 25. Their father, Shaphan, was was the scribe who had taken the discovered copy of God's law to the young king Josiah. That is in 2 Kings 22, verses 9 and verse 10. And then you look at the second man that is mentioned, Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah. He may have been the noble high priest from Josiah's reign, who found the book of the law in the house of the Lord and gave it to Shaphan. And that would be in 2 Kings 22 and verse 8. If this is correct concerning what I've shared about these two men, both of their families had exercised great influence upon the nation of Judah for many generations. So you're looking at some men who are well respected. You're looking at some men who have a long history with God and leadership in their families, if indeed those things are the case. These men were messengers. Messengers from who? In the context, from Zedekiah, king of Judah, to Nebuchadnezzar. It is thought these men may have been delivering Judah's annual tribute to their overlord or conducting other official business. When you look at the word overlord here, we're going to see that also discussed later on. An overlord is one who is under obligation. Really and truly, they're viewed more so as a slave. And these were oftentimes used to carry information, letters and such unto other nations. It was common for these diplomats to correspond between vassals, and their overlord was a part of the ancient world. A man by the name of J.A. Thomas says Jeremiah's letter was carried along with official correspondence in a diplomatic manner that was normal for people to do in those days. Look with me at verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who were carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. When you look at what's said here, we find is that the Lord is making it very clear, definite once again, that He is speaking through His prophet Jeremiah. And what does God identify? He says, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Before we have seen God say very directly, explicitly, I have punished you. I have moved you from Jerusalem to Babylon. Here in the context, God makes it clear. He says, whom I have caused to be carried away. How did God cause them to be carried away? What does that mean? To cause them to be carried away. Okay, that certainly is a factor. They rebelled against God. Their minds were set on this. And because their minds were set on it, God's letting them have what they wanted, right? But more so in this context, I believe it refers to Babylon. Is that God used Babylon to punish these people, to take them out of Jerusalem and then to bring them into Babylon, to serve Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. The reason that it is said that God caused it rather than in this context saying that He literally did it is because God is wanting us to understand that He used an avenue. He used a people to accomplish punishing Judah. And He enabled He allowed this to happen. That's right. And there's that expression, to cause this. He allowed it. And in fact, He moved He moved providentially to accomplish those things even. And so always we need to keep in mind this is a message from God, and God was responsible for punishing his people and causing and moving Babylon in that direction to punish them. What was the purpose of their Babylonian captivity? What was the purpose? Someone would say, and this is true, to punish them. But it was to bring about moral and spiritual transformation in the lives of his people. Absolutely. Ultimately, to bring them to their knees, if you would, in repentance. To turn away from. But God had to change their mind in order to change their thoughts, in order for that to result in a change of life. And therefore, it took punishment in order to accomplish that. Does God still punish people today? Absolutely he does. I think about the context of the book of Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through verse 11. And in that context, God says, those whom he loves, he chastens or disciplines. Have you ever been disciplined by God? I think all of our hands ought to go up by that. Do we understand how he did that? No, not really. But I would trust that there's been times in all of our lives where we've been out of line and God has used some form or fashion to discipline us. And a lot of times, I'm going to say, is that is the mind, that is the conscience. And whenever we realize we've done wrong in the sight of God, oftentimes that helps to wake us up. But sometimes we're like Judah, and the conscience is not a safe guide. And therefore, God will use whatever other means it would take to wake these people up, and sometimes even us.
If our mind is on worldly things, most of the time we don't catch it.
And that's true.
We're not thinking spiritual, we're thinking worldly, so we don't see that. We can attribute that probably to some kind of worldly event, just bad or something to that effect. And we don't see it. Probably God is trying to work in our lives to change us.
That's true.
So if you're not spiritually minded, you're probably not going to catch it.
That's right. And sometimes when we don't get it, he lets us run in that direction because we refuse, probably at that point in our lives, to accept the truth. And then other times he knows the heart, and it'll take something greater, and he will work in that direction as well. Nothing mystical or miraculous, but providentially he works and moves and to discipline and to bring people to him.
And the same thing happens when God blesses. Sometimes we
That's right.
don't see it.
That's right.
We don't understand where that blessing comes from. We just accept it as good luck.
Sure.
But if we sit there and think about it spiritually, we can kind of see that how things are working together for our good. We just don't notice it.
That's right. Open James chapter 1 and verse 17. James 1 and verse 17, please. Ricky says, God also blesses us, and oftentimes we don't think about that. We just go on our merry way and think, well, boy, that was lucky. I got lucky there, or boy, my hard work really paid off. And, I don't necessarily believe in luck. I believe, God operates, and he blesses us. That's right.
We have thought that God still moves
That's right.
within our life.
Never forsakes us, as Scripture affirms. Who is James 1:17?
Every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom can be no variation, neither shadow that is cast by turning.
Very good. So where do all the good blessings come from? They come from God. And God is faithful in all of that. And we're going to see some mentioning of the goodness of God later on in this context as well. There's 32 verses here, so we probably will not get all the way through this tonight. So when you look at what's going on in the context with these first 4 verses, you find it's going to be as Jeremiah has foretold. They would be there for 70 years in captivity. Since their stay was not going to be brief, as the false prophets had foretold, were predicting, here we find is that God instructed them. Look at verse 5. He says, build houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased, that you may increase and not diminish. So, as the prophet Jeremiah has been speaking to them about going into captivity, what was going to happen with their wives, with their family? They were going to die. They were going to perish, correct? Those who survived, what was going to happen with them? The Babylonians they were going to take their wives for their wives. They were going to take their children and make them slaves. What happened to their crops? Their crops, even though they produced, they weren't going to get the benefits off of it. Their enemies were going to come in and they were going to get the benefits off of all that. And then they were going to be carried into captivity. 2 deportations already, and a third one on its way that Jeremiah is speaking about. And therefore, God is saying to Jeremiah, now that these people are in Babylon, have them build houses, because they're not leaving tomorrow. When you go on vacation, how many ever go on vacation in here? Do you stay in a hotel, maybe rent a cabin or a house or something like that? You do that? How come you don't buy one? Well, maybe you have. I've not. We don't buy one because we're not going to stay there forever. We rent a place out. Now, if we're gonna be there a half year to a year, I'm probably going to look into buying it, because that would make greater sense. If I may be there the rest of my life, as far as I know, 70 years, then chances are I need to buy a place, right? And God uses this language to help them understand this is going to be your home. One generation is going to die off at least before you're able to go back. You're going to have time to plant gardens. And the idea that God says, eat of the fruit, what does that tell us about God's involvement with their vegetation, with their crops? He is blessing their crops. He wasn't blessing them before, but now in captivity, He's blessing them. Why would He do that? Because He wants them to understand that even though they brought His wrath out, and He's judging them in a strange land, they're not free to go about as they were in their own land. God still wants them to understand is that I love you. I want you to come back to me. I seek a relationship with you, and I want you also to seek a relationship with me. That is a monumental statement that we're going to find later. We'll probably get to that next week. God says something in the context, in the middle of this message, that really should have resonated with them, and it certainly needs to resonate with us, is that we ought to aspire to have a relationship with God.
You know, there's still something going on here. It's not really brought out in this text. When they were taken captive, they lost all of their stuff.
That's right.
They weren't able to take it back. Nebuchadnezzar took possession of their things, their beasts, their cattle, and so on. But while they're in captivity, yes, they have to live. But what's not being brought out here is that taxation or something else, they still have to pay Nebuchadnezzar.
Sure.
It's not going to be theirs. They have what they have to
That's right.
The richness that they're producing remains with them.
That's right. And will eventually fall into the hands of others. Absolutely.
Well, don't you think too, people at that time, they had to adapt. If they went into captivity, they had to adapt to them people's lives. They had to go on with their lives because they knew God was going to bring them out of there.
That's right.
That's why I look at it.
Yep.
You have to adapt around. You go around your surroundings.
That's right. You do. Just in going in mission fields, I know whenever you're there for a period of time, 3-4 weeks, and some missionaries, Stacy and Kathy, who were with us Sunday night, they go for 6 months, I believe it is, at a time.
You might
And
not
so,
like the way they live.
that's right.
You still have to be around them. And that's why you have to look.
That's right. That's right. Speaking of that, missionaries that we knew from Tanzania, East Africa, they went into Chamala Mission Field, and Darren and Carrie Stapleton. Darren spoke here a few years ago on our summer series, and they went into the mission field. They were there 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years, and he talked about going out into the bush and teaching there. And you're in the midst where they've got huts, and they're covered, some of them, with animal skin still. This goes back whenever they were serving anyway over there. And he said that they like to fix this pot of stuff to feed everybody with. And if you didn't eat with them, then they were offended. You had to assimilate to the surroundings. And he said they called that dish, or this stuff that they made, ugali. And he said whenever you taste it, you would understand why they call it ugali. Not good. So you're right. You have to adapt. They would have had to have adapted. 70 years is a long time, right? And a lot of them were not going to be able to go back because that generation has died off. And then this new generation that goes back, now they're going to have to go, when they do go back, they're going to have to make sure that they are focused on God and leave their ungodly tendencies that they picked up in Babylon behind as well. Kind of like what they did when they left Egypt, that first generation.
Well, as you brought that out, I was going to say, this is not an exodus from Egypt.
That's right.
In the 70 years when that happens, it's not going to be the same.
That's right.
God gave them abundance when they left.
That's right.
But this time, it's not going to be that way. They're not going to get to take everything back. When we live and we buy things and property and stuff, and we expect to give that to our children or something, so we're expecting to pass what we've worked hard for on down to the children and maybe the grandchildren.
Sure.
They're not going to be able to do this.
That's right.
When they leave out of Babylon.
Yeah, they're going to start over again.
But God is telling them they need to live for the moment, and He's going to make sure that they can.
Sure.
You're not going to get rich out of this.
Right. When they get back, when they are allowed to go back under the guidance of Zerubbabel, 536, I believe it is, in that time frame. Initially, if I'm thinking correctly, they poured the foundation of the temple, and then they let it set. And what were they doing? Do you know what they were doing in that meantime when they let it set? They were building their own houses. And I believe one of the prophets actually gives some insight that I can't recall that you find anywhere else, and I can't think of the prophet off the top of my head. But they were building their own extravagant, luxury-style homes, panel homes, which was very expensive back then. And so they weren't just, concerned about putting a roof over their heads. They were wanting to have their cake and eat it too. And then they're rebuked because it says that the temple lay in ruins while they were doing their own homes. And Ezra then comes on the scene. I believe it's 520 if memory serves me correct. And in 3 years, he's able to rally them into where they finish all of these works. Yeah. Ronnie, did you have something?
Oh, just like you talked about the Exodus. This is just going to be a remnant from.
That's right. I've heard estimates of somewhere around 10 to 15,000, if I'm thinking correctly on that. talking about the idea that they're supposed to take wives and to give their sons to wives and their daughters to husbands. Was he telling them to intermarry with? No, not at all. They were to take from their own people. And that goes back to Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and verse 4, Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 and verse 2. So strictly from their own people. And there's a lot of reasons on that, and the primary reason is because of the purity of the nation for the purpose of bringing Jesus eventually to the forefront. Okay, look with me now in verse 7. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive. The idea of study, it carries the understanding of searching for, and then also to investigate. In other words, look at the peace that these people in Babylon have. Search the ways in which God is blessing them so that they also then will be a blessing to you. Investigate all of their ways where they're happy, and then understand the way that God investigates, understand how He is working to bring you to a state of peace. Before the captivity, it was not peace. They had no peace at all with God. And God says, I want to have peace with you, but you're going to have to seek after that. And the only way in which you're going to achieve that is if you end up at peace with God. And seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in its peace you will have peace. What is Jeremiah telling the people to do here? God's speaking here, but he says, have peace and P-R-A-Y. What's that word? Pray. When I read through a couple of weeks ago and prepping for tonight and going back and rereading this afternoon for our lesson tonight, Jeremiah, early on, was really torn up and concerned about the people, right? And what did Jeremiah do for the people? He prayed for the people. Not once, not twice, but time after time. And what did God tell him finally? Stop praying for them. It doesn't matter what you want, Jeremiah. They don't want it. Stop praying for them, Jeremiah. It's going to happen. They're going to rebel. They're going to keep going down that path. And finally, they're going to be punished. And now Jeremiah is conveying to these people, seek the peace that your captors have, and pray to God. As you pray to God, he says, pray for in its peace, the peace that they see with Babylon, the ways that God was blessing them, you will have peace. What is God calling them to do here? To pray for peace. And we would even understand it, maybe the peace that surpasses all understanding, in the relationship with God. Pray that you'll be able to get to where you can trust in God, to where you will be loyal to God, to where that you will serve God. And that's where true peace really resides. Yes.
Like Apostle Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 2, 1 to 3, we got to pray for the king, for the government. I think this is the same thing where Jeremiah's telling, hey, pray for peace because you need,
That's right. That's right. When you look at the context there too, as Ronnie points out, when you get down to verse 4, am I thinking correctly? it says that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life. And then he goes on to say that God does not desire for anyone to perish. And that praying for the kings and such identifies that we are to be involved when it comes to world leaders and to pray for them constantly, that they will do what God wants us to do, and that we will not have, let me take it this far, that we will not have wars and other disruptions, so that we will be able to have a peaceful and quiet life, and so that people will be able to be won to Christ. And that's so true. And here in this context, that's very fitting to where God was wanting his people to get to. Anyone else?
He's also making them understand that they need to accept the fact that they have been judged.
That's right.
And they need to accept what the penalty
Acknowledge that.
but you're going to have to live through it. And I'm there for you, but you're just going to have to accept it.
That's right.
If you try to go against it, bad things will happen.
The Hebrew word for peace in this context speaks about safety. They're safe there, so long as they submit to the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, right? And God's already told them to do that. It carries with it the idea of soundness. I don't really have too much, I guess, on that. As the other one, though, is prosperity. Those who don't have to worry about where their next loaf of bread is going to come from, they can live in peace, right? And so God was going to bless them with a peace of mind to know that they were going to have what they needed. Not what they wanted, but that they would have what they needed. Before captivity, they were not in a position to pray. And here, though, Jeremiah tells these people that they are to pray to God. Here, though, God told them to pray for who? For Babylon, their enemy. And God says we are to pray for our government. We are to pray for our enemy. Why? The Jews' welfare was directly dependent upon the welfare of the Babylonians. If Babylon didn't do well, then the captives were not going to do well.
They were not going to live in a state of welfare either.
That's right.
Because he told them in verse 6, he told them, plant your gardens,
Right.
grow your food, and partake it.
And it would supply an abundance for them. This proved the wisdom and the depth of God's guideline. God's people were granted much liberty by the Babylonians. They were free to form colonies. They were given certain civic and also religious rights. But they were still bound under the strong hand of Nebuchadnezzar and ultimately those of Babylon. When you look at verses 8 and following, this section deals with their present problems and also gives promises for the future. And that's either saved by the bell or stopped by the bell. Next week we'll pick up with verse 8. That was quick. All right. Thank you very much.